Hello and welcome to Personable, a podcast focused on speaking to the world's best, enabling you to become the best that you can be. Today, I'm honored to be joined by Nina Bull Jørgensen. Nina is a seasoned journalist and communication specialist with experience spanning from Norwegian Broadcasting, the United Nations and Norad. She has worked across the Nordic region, Afghanistan and Mozambique, leading media initiatives, strategic communications and public engagement efforts. With a background in political science and journalism from Oslo University, she brings a deep understanding of global issues and storytelling. And in 1999, she won the NRK Prix Marine List, I think I'm saying that wrong, award for making the best feature radio report of the year. So Nina, I'm incredibly excited to talk to you today. As I mentioned to you before the podcast, looking at your resume and your background, I'm very nervous to talk to you because you've had a huge career spanning a lot in the journalism industry. So I thought you'd be able to see through my questions and what I'm trying to ask. But nevertheless, you've got an incredibly impressive background. And I wanted to initially ask if you could take me and the listeners through and tell me your story.
Thanks for that introduction. That was really nice. And just to say, I'm nervous too, because I'm more used to being the one asking the questions than actually answering the questions. And of course, when you introduced me, I was like, yeah, that's quite nice. But, when you actually invited me to this podcast, I was like, why is he inviting me? Because you've had all these, Olympic gold medal winners, the CEO of a billion-dollar company, the cheerleader of the year, or this super influencer with a million followers and so on. So I was a bit like, why me? So I had to do a kind of exercise, which I think everybody should do. Everybody should be invited to be in a podcast, because that made me make kind of an exercise, going through what's the plus in my life, what makes me unique. And I would say I didn't win any gold medals. I'm not a billionaire, but I feel that I'm rich still. And partly because of the things you mentioned, that I feel really rich when it comes to adventures, when it comes to having met people from all walks of life, from all corners of the world. And I think kind of my curiosity and my love for meeting people and love for digging behind, the obvious, the surface of people, that's what brought me into journalism in the first place. And I did some different studies like political science, psychology, Middle East studies, and so on. And I was, basically your age. I had no idea what am I going to be. I had this frustration because I was like going in different directions. And I think when I actually got into journalism, I started out with like a local TV station, then I worked in a student radio, and eventually I did like journalism studies. I kind of felt that all the loose ends were coming together, and it was just giving me the opportunity to actually get into any topic and just be curious, and be the one to ask the questions and learn more. So I did get into, after journalism studies, I got a job. I felt it was kind of easy, to be honest. All these other people you interview, they talk about all this hard work, to get to where they are and so on. And I felt that I was like studying, and then I got like an internship at the Norwegian Broadcasting, which is more or less equal to BBC in England. And I got into this like really kind of prestigious newsroom radio program. And I was I remember I was so nervous before starting there, just to say that I didn't sleep for like a week. And I had this strategy that, I'm not going to reveal myself for being like I'm not blonde, but looking blonde. So my strategy was only to open my mouth whenever I knew exactly, what I was going to say. And before I knew it, I was like put as a hostess on this program. that, well, at the time used to be really popular. And this is going back, well, more or less 25 years. So it was at a time where you didn't have like all these like podcasts or like YouTube channels and a lot of TV channels and so on. And you had to listen to radio when it was on air at the time. And I remember somebody telling me that there's 1 million listeners to this radio program, which I think it was when it was really at the peak. But when I was asked to be the hostess, it was maybe 400,000 or 500,000 listeners.
So small audience when you were doing that.
Yeah, well, at the time it was the radio program that
I was joking. I was joking. Yeah.
yeah. Anyways, so I remember I probably peaked that moment, without knowing that that was the peak of my career.
Yeah.
But anyways, and then it went down. No, just kidding. Then,
But how is that sort of radio things? Because I know you've done like a lot of things like in the middle in terms of building up a career. Because I feel
yeah,
like a lot of other careers, for example, you go work at like a bank and you start like, like the front man, and you become like a manager, and then you become like a director, and then, it's very obvious in terms of the stages.
yeah,
Whereas in
yeah,
terms of journalism, for a lot of people, as someone outside of the industry, it might
yeah.
be who's able to break the biggest story. And so there might be a flatter level of like who's higher up or who's not. So in your career, you now work for Norad. What is Norad? Is that about representing Norway? And why do you
Yeah.
think, what made you fit for that role and has made you so good at that?
Yeah, okay. Yeah, well, going from journalism, I actually went, uh, there was an opportunity of working in the UN for the Human Development Program that also came up, and I grabbed it. So I worked for a few years in Copenhagen and in Mozambique, and I traveled to a lot of countries. So I really learned a lot about development aid and
Yeah.
what the world looks like. I ended up staying 10 years out of Norway. So when coming back to Norway, looking for different work opportunities, kind of being a bit blank, I was jumping a bit back and forth. I did a bit of journalism again. And now being in Norad, I think basically Norad is a bit like DFID, if you know DFID. It's kind of grant management, and we are also giving
Right.
advice. We are kind of a directorate or an
Okay.
agency, which is
Yeah.
below or under the Ministry of Foreign Affairs.
Yeah.
So we are basically taking all the aid money, development aid money of Norway, and making it happen. Making it. It's a bit like USA idea. If
Yeah.
lately there's been a lot of news about how the new administration is kind of cutting down on or freezing the means. So in Norway, Norad has a quite important role in managing the funds that goes to countries, African countries, or global issues like climate financing, or global health, or education in African countries or Latin America, and so on. So, but basically, my job is to work with communications, to inform and to also kind of engage people and mobilize to debate and so on. And I think basically, having lived a few years, having been to many places, and having worked hands-on with development aid, I think it puts me in a position to be quite confident in the job that I have.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah. Something the most involved I've been in terms of engaging with like agencies and also with government sort of press secretaries or people in charge of that sort of realm have been in the United States. Obviously, I'm at college here in the US, And on top of that, what Donald Trump is doing and trying to use DOGE, the Department of Government Efficiency, to try and cut down on agencies. It's spreading a lot more light on agencies throughout the world, things that, I don't even know half the agencies in the UK, for example. And then on top of that, you kind of had these quite entertaining arguments or questions that are asked to the president's press secretary. And so you kind of see the responses from that. But kind of from your perspective, with the work that you're trying to do for Norway, what is it like trying to represent a whole country from a communications perspective? And what do you do when you don't know an answer to a question? Or like, how do you go about representing a whole country? Because I feel like there's one thing to make a mistake and, misrepresent yourself, but when you're representing millions of people, I feel like that's a whole different stage.
Yeah, most definitely. That's why I miss being a journalist sometimes, because you have to watch your steps so carefully. And especially now, because Norway has always had a very, good relationship with the US, and US is huge when it comes to development aid. It's like by far the biggest donor, and both when it comes to like humanitarian assistance, but also like long-term development. So, representing Norway, you don't want to step wrong. You want to emphasize that we've had a great relationship with the U.S. for many years, and we hope to continue to be collaborating and so on. But yeah, we have to choose our words carefully, and I think we have to have a division of roles, because we are a directorate, so we are kind of feeding the Ministry of Foreign Affairs with facts, with advice, and with information, but we are not the ones to actually have political opinions. So when journalists call, and quite a few journalists have actually called these days because they want our opinion on what's going on in the US, we have to be really careful and just like give out, these are the facts, and not be opinionated. And I think because we are in very close dialogue with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, they have kind of, they have write down kind of, how do you say, like message platforms, like it's not like you just speak open and freely, you carefully think, you have groups of people getting together to actually kind of make sure that what comes out in the right way. That is
This
good. Yeah.
this may seem, I'm not a historian, but sort of from my perspective, I mean, even this is happening now with Russia, Ukraine, and same with Israel and Palestine in terms of trying to gain more land for their countries. But for the most part, a couple hundred years ago, even when the UK had one of the biggest kingdoms in the world, owning over 25% of the world's landmass, there was a clear reason why countries wanted to get involved with other countries to sort of take the land, to get more resources, get more people within their country and to grow. And then there's sort of been this transitionary period in the sort of what I would like to call the modern era, in which you have countries like Norway, countries like the UK, countries like the US, who are giving humanitarian aid without expecting anything in return. But now, with Donald Trump back in power, I mean, it's kind of half a joke, half not a joke. He suggested the idea of buying Greenland or also buying the Gaza Strip from Palestine to, rebuild that area. Not as much focusing on those points, but more so on the bit of in terms of giving humanitarian aid. If they don't expect anything in return, this may seem like a stupid question, but why would countries even want to give to other countries? Why is aid so important? And why do you think taxpayers in one country want to give their money to help those in another country which they're not directly helped by?
I think that's a really good question. And I think, what I'm going to say now is a message that we really need to reach out with, because I think the trends these days all over the world is kind of like to be more concerned about yourself, your own country, America first or Norway first and so on. We have our own problems here, so why should we spend our tax money on, things far away or people far away from us? But I think it's really, really clear that giving aid or collaborating, we say, we don't say we give, but we actually do have partnerships with organizations and in other countries and with other countries. It's a kind of common objective of making this world better. And there are certain issues like climate change. It doesn't have any borders. You saw with the corona pandemic, global health, the vaccine issue, developing vaccines and so on. The pandemic, it didn't, see borders. And there are lots of, even, if you see like war and war zones, you have people who escape from wars and they are migrating. So the migration and people fleeing for it could be like fleeing from war, but it could be also fleeing from like drought or areas that no longer where you can't live anymore because of climate change. It can be natural disasters and so on, and they are crossing the Mediterranean, coming to Europe. So it's kind of like it all kind of. Everything is linked to everything, problems far away, they actually do affect us. So I think giving aid is not just giving, it's also receiving, it's for our own good. We are all in the same boat. And I think that's a really important message to get out to people in these days, where people think that, you kind of look to the tip of your nose and you look at your own wallet and you don't want to give anything, or you want to kind of shut the flow of money out.
Yeah, I would I would kind of second those points. Like, I think you've given a really good perspective there of like how it sort of comes back in return. I mean, even like from an economic standpoint, in terms of what Donald Trump's doing with the tariffs at the moment, like the fact that he's putting tariffs on to help American citizens, if those tariffs stay there, that'll actually lead to higher cost to consumers, and so the price of electric vehicles will go up, and a lot of things that are imported from Canada, Mexico, China. I know that those tariffs have actually been delayed at this point in time, but that will have like a knock-on effect. And it's the same with like foreign aid. It's the same with the development of things like the coronavirus vaccines. Like, these are things that, although they're being targeted to other countries, will come back and pay in spades. And the last point on that sort of relevant issue of the Israel-Palestine war, like if that broke out to a wider conflict throughout the Middle East, Israel is obviously an ally of the US, and I saw Donald Trump talking yesterday about how he wants Iran to stop producing nuclear weapons. And so if a wider conflict broke out within that region, that could lead to a war between the US and Iran. So it might seem like, why are they giving so much money to this cause completely unrelated to what's happening to US citizens? But that could actually break out to the wider region. I would talk more to what's happening in the politics of Norway, but I'm less informed, so it's easier to use the US as a comparative example. The second quick point I want to make on that, I took a philosophy class last semester, and they were given this analogy of a drowning child, and it's put forward by a philosopher called Peter Singer, who's pretty famous within philosophy. And the drowning child analogy is essentially like, let's say you're wearing, for yourself, like you're wearing a brand new dress, or you're wearing a brand new suit, like it costs a couple $100 or a couple £1,000. It's really nice. But then suddenly there's like a little pond, and you can't see the parents anywhere, but there's a child drowning in that pond. Do you either keep your new dress or suit, perfectly nice and brand new, and you just walk past, or hopefully you'd probably get in that pond, ruin your suit, ruin your dress, and get that child out. And the point was to say that you see that child in front of you and you want to save it. So why wouldn't you want to save a child that's a couple thousand miles away? So those were the two sort of main points that kind of came into my mind after you said that.
Yeah. No, good point. Obviously, the further away things are, the less important it feels. Even in journalism, it's this kind of like, what's a good news story? Whoever takes like journalism education, you'll hear this, that you have 100,000 people being killed in a war in Africa. You kind of listen to it and it passes, and the next thing is that maybe in UK, it's like kind of close to Norway, and it's like 10 people being killed in a mass killing. It's like, oh, that's horrible. And then, well, when something happens in your own country, it's even more important. And if it happens in your own neighborhood, you're really, really shocked. It really affects you. You might go to church and get together and, put candles out, and you really engage. But maybe it wasn't even somebody you knew, but in the end, you will cry more for your own, cat that died, than you do for those 100,000 that were killed in a war in Africa. It will ruin your day more than just looking at the news, seeing 100,000 people. Do you understand what I'm saying? It's kind of like
exactly.
how people engage. It really, and of course, that's the challenge for somebody like me working with communications, trying to communicate issues that are so far away, because people do really care more about, their own cat or dog or, the next door neighbor.
Yeah, I think it's there's two main points that come to mind on that. I think the first one, and I think the reason why it's harder for the average person, I mean, most people, in fact, to actually understand why they're giving foreign aid or focus on climate change or things like that, because these are top-down issues that affect the whole world, whereas on an individualistic basis, what most people care about is, do I have enough money in my pocket? Am I able to get my next meal? How much is my rent costing? How much is my kid's education and stuff like that? And so like, I always like dividing stuff up of like, what's important, not important, and what's urgent and not urgent. So like the urgent might be for them like, oh, I need like money, or I need food, or I need my kid's education. And it's obviously important as well. But something like this is important, but might not be as urgent in that person's life. So they might think, oh, climate change, that's happening in 5 or 10 or 20 years. So it's important, but I don't need it right now. When in actuality, as you know more of the statistics, in X amount of years, there's irreversible change. And irreversible change has already occurred if you don't face things like climate change or other issues like that. And I think a last example on that, with regard to what you were saying about not caring about what happens in other countries, I think when Greece went bankrupt, that's a great example of something going wrong. Because until it's you in that situation and your country going bankrupt, or your country in a situation that's not able to be repaired without the help of others, it's easy to say, why the hell would we want to help them when it's not yourself? But the world needs to come together in times like that to become a better sense of community and self, and drive itself forward. I think we've kind of touched on a few points there in terms of the importance of helping the international community. But having had so much experience in the journalism world, there's obviously been a rise in divisiveness in the media, particularly in the US, with certain medias being fully to the right and only giving that sort of opinion, and some medias going fully to the left and only giving that sort of opinion. What do you think, if the media is set up in that sort of way, what do you think is the importance of journalism, of getting the right stories out there? And do you think we need more impartial media in the US and the rest of the world?
Yeah, well, good question. I think all journalists should aim at being impartial. But that being said, it's almost impossible to be. I think even, with kind of having the face of being impartial, you will always choose the topic, you choose how you want to cover things. You always choose like a small part of the big picture. But yeah, I see. I mean, I do follow the news in the US, and it's obvious, but at least if you put on CNN or you put on Fox News, you know what you get. So at least it's kind of honest,
But do they know? Like I say that not to be like rude or like even as devil's advocate, but like I feel like the people at some of the smartest institutions in the world, it's pretty obvious what side they're leaning. But if you're going to go to someone in, rural Texas and you put on CNN or you put on Fox News, I don't think that they would, maybe I'm being presumptuous, but I don't think they would know there's a bias to this media. I think they would just say, this one's the truth and this one's not. These people are lying. This is fake news and this is real news. Like, I don't think people actually understand this is influenced towards one side of the political spectrum. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you. I just wanted to, I just thought that
Yeah,
was.
yeah, no, no, I think you're just putting your finger on a huge challenge, and it's not just about mainstream media. It's about like how the social media works as well, and people do get into rabbit holes. They get more of the information that confirms what they're already thinking. So I'm not going to say it's the lost case because that's really sad, but I think, well, my children and the younger generation, they need to be really well educated in seeing through, to be critical to everything they consume from mainstream media or from social media. So, but what we really need is, we still need, media with a kind of, how do you say, an editor, that
Yeah.
at least, it's kind of a newsroom and it's somebody responsible for what goes out. But it's a huge challenge. In Norway today, we had this like big press conference with the secret services and the police and so on, saying that more than ever, Norway is under threat, which I think goes for every country. But we are like next door to Russia. We are in a strategic position. We have like the northern areas that is interesting for China, Russia, and the US. So they're saying already, this kind of hybrid war going on, how the, certain forces, whether it's Russia, China, or other powers, kind of trying to influence through social media, and without us even knowing, we're being influenced. So that's kind of scary, and have you heard stories on how certain powers have influenced elections and so on through kind of going into people's brains without people knowing that? So I think now it's really, really important that young people, are educated to be really critical to everything they are fed with.
Where's the balance between journalism and activism?
Yeah, that's again a good question. I think, well, there you come to the point where you, being like working for the national broadcasting, working for BBC or NRK as I did, you cannot be an activist, but there will always be someone at some part of the spectre, of political spectre, that will say you're an activist, you are partial, because you choose, for example, a lot of TV, reports from Palestine showing the Palestinian side of the conflict, but then an editor will always say, well, we have to balance it, but sometimes it shines through, and I think in certain newspapers, exactly what that newspaper stand for, so they might be a bit more like leftist newspaper, so it looks a bit more like activism, but I think being a real activist is different from being a journalist that writes about things that are engaging, that journalist or that newsroom actually think is important. But I don't know actually what you want me to say about like finding the right balance.
I think I wasn't really anything more for you to say in terms of like, I'm kind of just curious on your opinion on it. There was no
Yeah.
edge that I wanted on your answer, but I kind of go back to like when you were working on the public radio, for example,
Yeah.
and you talked about the likes of women's issues, freedom of speech, religion, poverty, and social issues.
Mm.
And so when you're in a position like that, and I think I kind of know the answer in the back of my head, but
Mm.
are you just talking about things because you're just saying this is what's going on? Or are you talking about things because you want something to change? And so I feel like there's a fine, sorry, I didn't mean balance, I meant
Yeah,
fine line between
yeah,
media and just telling a story versus telling the story to drive change.
yeah. Well, I guess every journalist is different, but I think in my case, yeah, I would always have kind of an objective. I would always kind of fight to, it wouldn't necessarily be me deciding, but I would have the ideas and then I would pitch the idea to my boss, and it would always be something that I think we don't have enough attention to this problem, this issue, you know. So yeah, women's rights or climate issues, or even just trying to understand the driving forces behind the problem. For example, you hear about like this jihadist movements in Africa, and you think it's horrible. These people are just horrible, and these terrorists, terrorizing in Nigeria, Boko Haram, or you have in Al Shabaab in Somalia, in Kenya, or you have in Mali, and so on. It's like cells or movements that are really doing a lot of horrible things on the African continent, and of course that's obvious. If you write a story about that, you know what you get. It's horrible. But I kind of want to write stories where you try to understand what's behind. For example, I went to Kenya. I went to an area where you find a lot of young people being recruited to Al Shabaab, to this jihadist movement. And I wanted to find out why, how could like normal, nice young people go into such a horrible terrorist organization? And I found answers in kind of the social conditions of people living in certain areas. And I met this woman, she told me her story about how she was actually kind of fooled into before she knew it, she was like in Somalia, and she was kind of stuck in this Al-Shabaab camp. And she told how she was like gradually radicalized. She told me how the experience of like killing a person, the first time she actually had to pull the trigger against the head of a fellow countryman, and it was such a strong story. And if you just saw it from the surface, you would think this woman is horrible, she's cynical, she has like no heart. But when you really listen to the story and what took her there, that's when you really start understanding, the world and what's wrong, And I think that's the way of changing the world. You try to listen to people and try to really understand instead of just judging from, headlines or what you see in the first place. So I guess for me as a journalist, that's the kind of motivation.
Yeah, I think whenever you have two countries that aren't willing to speak to each other, that's where the real, war breaks out. Is because it's only by communicating with people that you can understand their humanity and understand that actually they're just like you and me, and where does the driving force, come behind that. I also think it's fascinating to think that even that person who was involved in that jihadist, sort of group realized that she'd made a mistake. And so I think it's imperative that when we talk about the consumption of, with regard to social media, I think if people find it quite obvious, oh, I've spent 4 hours on Instagram or on TikTok, that's changing my brain, but it's sort of said as a joke. But in every single interaction, every book you read, every article, every news channel you watch, that is changing the chemistry of your brain, how you think, your beliefs, and what it makes you do. And on the one hand, you might think that you're this perfectly normal, rational being, but as you hear these little things over time, it fundamentally changes who you are. And another point that I found was particularly fascinating was with regard to how media and how movements and the exchange of information has an influence on people. So if I think of like the Nazi regime in Germany in the last century, and in terms of a lot of dictatorships throughout the world, the mass grouping of people is not allowed. You know, you're not allowed to form protests because that's just a way to exchange information across. And so if you think about it in these, I don't want to name countries because I don't want to be killed. But if you think about all of those groups coming together, and that's the only way that people are allowed to give their true opinions to one another. But then with the traditional media, with social media, we're blocked by the algorithms choosing what we see and the media choosing what we see. You know, there's these higher powers that are deciding what we consume and therefore what we think and how we act. And I think that's particularly dangerous. On that point, in terms of influence, I'm currently recruiting for sales and trading jobs in investment banking. So I'm really curious about, you know, what's happening in financial markets and then how that, you know, impacts the rest of the world. But something I found really strange is how much hedge fund managers, how much politicians, people in positions of power are saying, you should buy this stock or you should sell this or you should do this. And so I'm curious on your thoughts on the intersection between journalism and finance, whether you think it's not necessarily if it's legal, because it's legal in a lot of cases, but whether you think it's ethical, and how we can go about building a society in which finance and media should be separated in some way or interconnected, depending on what you think.
Oh, yeah. I was never really all that into like finance or finance journalism, but I obviously know there are certain rules about what inside trade and so on, and but I don't know if that's a good question for me to answer. I think everybody needs information to be able to maneuver in the financial world. So you have like Financial Times, or you have like financial newspapers here in Norway, and I think everyone who's like interested in trade or stock exchange and so on, I think as in any other journalism, you need to kind of strive for being impartial. But you also have to inform, if one company, tech company or whatever, international or national company is doing really well, you report on it. But then probably they will do even better just because you report on it. It kind of becomes like a self-fulfilling prophecy. So I guess that's what you were kind of hinting at, like you're getting the boost through media. So it becomes like you become bigger just because of that. But I think that's a bit how the world is. Any company that is doing well, even if it's like a kind of bubble that, how do you say, a soap bubble? Sometimes it's like inflated, different. I think everybody's striving, for attention and for getting positive or even negative, whatever, attention in media or social media, whatever. It's just boosting you. But I don't know if you could tell like journalists not to report because it's influencing the markets. I don't really have a strong opinion on that, but I think it would be problematic because in general, journalists should have the integrity. It's like at the core of a journalist to have the integrity that you report on what you see, you report on the facts, you check the facts, but you report on what you think your audience find interesting. And if you are a financial journalist, so you do report on what you think that, your audience want to know.
Yeah. I mean, I've been really fascinated.
That was a good answer.
No, it was good. It was great. I've been fascinated by this because particularly within cryptocurrency, you get these influencers, even people like Elon Musk, he's the richest man in the world, or at least the public richest man in the world. And he can post on his platform, formerly known as Twitter, X, and say, buy this cryptocurrency, and then a ton of people will buy it. And I've always found this stupid, even being a little kid, I'd be like, how can someone just tell me buy this and then it does well? Like, how is that allowed? But it made me think about something one of my professors said to me at Duke. So this professor I have has about 500,000 followers, and I'm in a social media class with him. And a lot of the content I've been trying to make on TikTok, right? Like I'll offer my opinion on something or try and offer some smart insight about something, and it won't get many views. Like it'll get a couple hundred views, but compared to what it could get, videos he makes gets a couple 100,000 or a couple million views. So, that's 1 to 1,000.
You'll
It's
get
quite
there.
small.
You'll
I'll,
get
I'll
there.
get there. But
Yeah,
the point
for sure.
the point is to say that is me, Harvey Bracken-Smith, offering my opinion on things. But what he says to do is go where the opinion already is. So if you have an audience that's already interested in a conspiracy theory or really into this type of dog or really into this one of 10 Ferrari that's being produced or being, sold in Saudi Arabia, go to where those views and those clicks already are, because that's what will drive more. If I'm suddenly like, there's this snake in Antarctica, it's the first snake in Antarctica, and people are like, I don't care. Even if I think it's the most interesting story, people won't go to it. And so I think the reason these news agencies are driving to these extreme views is because that's what gets more clicks, that's what makes them more money. And because they are, for-profit organizations, I think that's what drives them. On that sort of point, with the drives of media organizations, as I've kind of hinted at there, and sure, there are some impartial ones as well, and government-led ones. I think a big thing in the social media landscape is this idea of conspiracy theories. And throughout time, people have always wanted to, think there's aliens or think about Bigfoot, even whether they're true or not true, folk tales that kind of get changed over time. People like talking about them. Because you're obviously in a government organization, you've probably come across things like this in the work you're doing or the work you're not doing. So on that point, what do countries want us to think or believe? And how do governments go about stopping conspiracy theories?
Oh, yeah. Well, we are not on TikTok. We are not allowed to be on TikTok, so we can't beat those who are big on TikTok. But at least we try to reach out to, opinion leaders. We try to reach out through the channels that we have with facts and my boss, he has this saying, which is in Norwegian, it sounds really cool, fakta har makta. In English, it doesn't sound that cool, but it's like
I think I'm
facts.
saying something bad.
Fakta har makta. It means facts have the power. It means facts inform policy, So we at least try to repeat and repeat and repeat. These are the facts. So we try to kind of hit back on conspiracy theories with facts. But of course, we cannot do that alone. But we at least try to, keep with or reach out to partners and allies and opinion leaders and so on. So we at least can try to, how do you say, correct a bit the stories that go around. But it's a huge it's really a huge challenge. And, in development aid, there are some stories about, this kind of money just going through the window, kind of going to corrupt leaders in Africa and, being wasted on ridiculous projects and so on. So we just, we can't take each and every one of those stories and say, oh, that's wrong, that's wrong, that's wrong. But we try to highlight positive stories and we try to give out facts. So it's kind of a huge challenge and more challenging, the way the world and the media landscape looks these days.
Because you've been around so many different places in the world, different people, places, tribes, communities, what do you think is the biggest misconception you think people have about those people, places or things that when you actually went and reported there and learned more about those groups that you found to be different?
Well, I definitely think Africa is misunderstood. I think when certain people just talk about, excuse the expression, shithole countries, and it's kind of like, most of the things you hear from different African countries is like about wars, it's about diseases or about crisis here and there. And I also just saying Africa, it's actually 54 very different countries. So I think kind of a mission for me, and you might call it like being an activist, but it's actually to tell the positive stories. You don't even have to go far to find like really, how do you say, progressive people, people in African universities or people in business or young people who are like full of, startup skills, doing different businesses, and myself moving to Mozambique. I was a journalist, and I was moving there, and I started working in this like media development project, and I was going around to different community radios to teach journalism and to teach about freedom of expression, freedom of the press, and so on. And I remember I was like introduced as this like, here's this, a bit like you introduced me, basically. This star journalist from Norway, now she's going to teach you guys in, Mozambique how to do it. And I was with, I was planning this course with a young lady. She was like 10 years younger than me, young African local lady. And basically, she was the best teacher I've ever met. She was like we were doing like these trainings together, and she was fantastic. And I was like, she's not learning from me, I'm learning from her. And that's what I experienced in many, situations. Working in Mozambique or South Africa, going to Namibia or Botswana, I would always meet people that I could really, really admire and think I'm learning a lot. So I think this kind of conception that we go to Africa and we help and we educate and we kind of come with the great solutions and so on is a total misconception. And here comes the point again that I was trying to give earlier, that, go behind the surface and try to figure out the story of each and every person, and you will see that person is rich and have a rich story and is smart and have something to share, something that you can learn from. And only from there you can find solutions, not by you going somewhere and telling people what to do or thinking that you have the solutions already.
If you could change one thing about the world, what would it be?
Oh, well, most definitely that people, I would say peace, of course, make peace, but that's a kind of too broad, but that people that disagree actually start listening to each other. That people that disagree actually try to put themselves in the shoes of the person or the leader or the other country that you are in war with. Try to put yourself on the other side. That one thing I would like to see.
Who should control the media?
Well, definitely not governments. Definitely not people with a lot of money. I think media should be independent all over the place, and I don't think commercial powers should have all that much power. So, it should be different people, but not a mix of economy and politics. Media should be free.
How do you think media will change over the next 10 years?
I don't know. I think AI might change a lot. But we don't really know what's coming next, like 10, 15 years ago, we didn't even know about like Facebook or, I remember actually I was like making a radio program about like this new, how do you call it? This new job that people have, which was called YouTuber, it was like this really new thing, being a YouTuber. And it's kind of difficult to predict what it will look like. I hope that the mainstream media with kind of editorial content will survive, because otherwise we will And I think actually the story, like storytelling, being good at storytelling, whatever channel you use, whether you write, you use a camera, whether it's YouTube, podcast, or national TV, I think telling a good story will always win. So I hope and I pray that, telling true stories and good stories will survive. But I'm afraid like young people these days, they won't really, sit around the fireplace and watch like the news at 7 o'clock p.m. So I think it will be much more fragmented, I'm afraid.
How do you tell a good story?
I think how to tell a good story, I think first of all you need something that the audience can relate to. Something that is common for everyone, and then you need to find something that is like it's something that is current, something that makes you curious, and I think it's to have a kind of surprising element, a story that gives you something you didn't expect. And of course, there's always a kind of way of teasing a little bit first, and then you tell something, and then you have a surprise moment coming in later, and so on. So, but I don't know. I think also it's about like you being engaged in the way you tell the stories.
How do you get someone to open up?
That's a good question. You are good at that. I've listened to your podcast, and no, I think asking open questions and also being, not too aggressive in your questions. That you actually really try to understand and try to meet at the same level. Not patronize people. And show that you're just genuinely curious, and don't make like judgmental comments, but just ask open questions. It's amazing, when you ask people just an open question, like tell me your story, or why is that, and sometimes be a little bit daring, like you actually dare to ask a bit of sensitive questions. Sometimes you can say you don't really have to answer this question if you think it's like too sensitive or if it's too difficult to answer. And it's surprising how many times the question you thought you were afraid of asking, or that they actually answer. Like this lady I told you about, I asked her, so, did you ever kill anyone? And she said, yes. I said, you don't have to answer if you don't want to, but she said, yes, I did. And I said, can you describe that moment? Again, I said, you don't have to if you don't want to. But then she did, which was a very, strong moment, listening to somebody. And then she was also telling about how that was haunting her. That she still see the face. Many years later, she can see the face of that person. But to actually have somebody open up, I think you just kind of have to balance, how direct you are, but not push too much.
Yeah, I think people get it backwards and they think that the harsher you are and the more specificity you get in a person, they think in their minds, oh, I'll be able to get the answers out of them, I'll be able to squeeze it out of them. Whereas I've kind of found the opposite effect. The more willing I am to, take something out if someone's not willing, or the more warm I am and kind and willing to understand them, their story and their perspectives, the more they feel that I'm a peer to them, and that they can really talk to me about their things and not think about anything else. The more willing I've found that people are actually to open up. It's only those times that they feel restricted and, oh no, what if I say this next, that they don't open up. And I would actually argue, not just on a podcast, but in day-to-day life, that 99% of people want to tell you their story. Like, you could talk about anything, like literally, what was the game last night? And then they'll say, oh yeah, I was with my kids and my kids' dog's doing this these days. And, sometimes I find it annoying. It's almost too easy that people just want to tell you their stories. And it's not about probing, but rather that just showing genuine, warm interest in them that gets them to open up. I wanted to ask 3 final questions. The first of these being, if I was to ask someone in 100 years' time, what would you want your legacy to be and how would you want them to describe you?
Okay. I would like my legacy to be that... Oh, I have to think. I was somebody spreading positive energy, and I was someone who opened up people's minds, that I was a welcoming person. I want my kids to always say that our mother always had an open house, and that I was somebody that never judged or never aimed for the top. I would, have equal talks and compassion and mingle with anybody from any walks of life. And hopefully as a journalist, or as a communications person, I would like people to say that Nina was somebody that opened our eyes and cracked some myths, that scratched behind the surface and kind of revealed things about other people, other cultures that we didn't know from before, and that opened our eyes.
What's next for you?
That's a good question too. I have the job that I have, which I'm happy with, and there's always some new travels and so on that will expand my horizon. But I do also miss journalism, so I might go back to journalism. And sometimes, because I started out saying that, that you have been interviewing all these CEO and #1 people, on top here, on top there, and so on. And I think I've been kind of moving more sideways, and I feel rich when it comes to adventures and all the things I've done. But every once in a while, I do think that, maybe one day I should be, the boss too. That would be interesting to, actually be a kind of leader that is motivating others and, using my wisdom to actually kind of nurture others, coming up. But I don't know what's next. I still don't know what I want to be when I'm, grown up.
And my final question, and I ask this to every guest on Personable, is what is one thing that you would want a listener to take away from this episode?
Well, I think I said already to listen to others, to try to put yourself in other people's shoes. But there's one thing I actually didn't say that I think is quite important, and that is, in general, I think it's really important to listen and to listen to other people's advice. It doesn't mean that you have to follow the exact same path as that CEO who's selling all those shirts, or, the gold medal winner of golf. But listen to the advice, but use the advice the way you want, because you know best yourself what's good for you. There's not one recipe that fits all. So I think it's really important to keep confident about the choices you make. You don't have to make the same choice as others. Look for what makes you happy and be honest to yourself about what makes your life rich, which might not be money or a gold medal.
Thank you very much, Nina. It's been fascinating to talk to you today. I mean, it goes without saying, just like now and when you gave that talk and when you were teaching at that school, that you've got an incredibly impressive career journey in everything you've been able to do. And I'm glad that you say that it's not about necessarily where you are now, but that you're rich in life experiences. And I think that's the most important thing. It's common on people's deathbeds that they don't, it's all regret. It's regret of what they could have done, not about what they did do. And I think that's truly impressive. I'm also really happy you brought up that story with the girl and how you were able to move her forward to ask whether she did end up taking someone's life and talk about what that's really like. Because I think for so many people, myself included, it's so easy just to label someone as this thing, this police officer, this teacher, this jihadist. But underlying that surface, even though she's done a horrific thing, she is still a girl that's done something bad, that was made to think a certain way. And I think it's the ability to humanize people and truly understand who they are and what they're like, that will enable you to go and do the best things. I mean, even, someone listening to this that wants to, if you're a police officer and you want to get information out of a serial killer, humanize them and make them feel on your level, and then they'll truly open up to you. I think it's also fascinating. There was that film, The Matrix. I don't even know what year it was put out, but it kind of suggested this idea of the red pill, blue pill, in which you can kind of be blind to all the information in front of you, or you can choose to sort of leave and plug out and sort of see the world as it is. And I think it's interesting that while you have those figures that tell you to unplug from the matrix, the sort of world is, moving to an even more matrix-like world in which the information we're seeing, we can't even tell it's real. There used to be that thing, I am religious, so take it with a pinch of salt, but you had these things of whether a god in Christianity or Islam or Judaism, whatever, someone does something or someone sees a miracle, and the people around them are like, oh, that didn't happen, I don't believe it, blah, blah, blah. And then they're seen as these sort of non-believers. But the danger of social media is that you can now see these things happening. Same with AI. You can see that car crash that never happened. You can see that conspiracy theories as aliens that never happened. And so, it's people say, oh, you can't believe without seeing. But now people are seeing things that aren't real and don't really know what to believe. I think it's fascinating, this world of media, which is constantly going to change. And I applaud you for staying in a space so long, which with so much contention, argument, and divisiveness, but also the ability to try and bring people together at the same time. I really enjoyed our conversation, and I hope those listening did as well. So thank you so much, Nina.
And thank you. Thanks for inviting me. It was a pleasure.